States Fire Science Consortium, and I'll be moderating the webinar this afternoon. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background about who we are and what we do. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and one of 15 regional consortia or fire science exchanges across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, and adoption of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners and work to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners, organizations and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to science delivery while at the same time facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few seconds to explain our webinar interface using Adobe Connect here this afternoon. If you'd like to ask a question or interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Once you type your question, just click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them at the end or during the webinar. Please note you can only view the chat box when you are not in the full screen mode. Also, I should note that today's webinar includes some really neat video of a prescribed burn captured from a mobile phone. And due to the size of this video file and presentation, you may experience a slight lag as we transfer between slides depending on the speed of your internet connection. So please keep that in mind if you find the slide transitions moving slowly when viewing the presentation today. We'll do our best to make sure that we stay in sync. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about the Lake States Fire Science Consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfiresci.net. And please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of other activities. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. So, on to today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Steve Goldman, District Ranger on the Mayo District of the Huron-Manistee National Forest. Steve graduated from the University of Arizona with a BS in Forest and Watershed Management and has been with the U.S. Forest Service for 23 years, serving on the Coronado, Cherokee, and Huron-Manistee National Forests. For the past 9 years, Steve has served as the District Ranger for the Mayo Ranger District of the Huron-Manistee and is responsible for the supervision of all Forest Service operations on the 225,000-acre Mayo District. Steve has considerable experience with fire and currently is qualified as a Type 2 Incident Commander. Today, Steve will be sharing with us the story of the Maple Ridge prescribed burn, an effort to introduce crown fire back into managed jack pine forests. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Charles. And good afternoon to everybody. This is my first webinar, so I will apologize up front if I fumble through this a little bit, but I hope I've got a lot of good information for y'all. And if you have questions, please ask. I'll try to answer them as they come in. If I can't handle the volume, we'll try to answer them at the end because there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers then. So with that, we'll get started. And what I'm going to do for about the next hour is I'm going to take you on a 34-year trip. That trip starts with tragedy and it ends with success. But the journey doesn't end, and this is just one prescribed burn and in one area. But we have to put a historical context to this project before we can even talk about the project, and you'll understand why here in just a minute. So next slide. Okay, the project area for the Maple Ridge prescribed fire is right dead center at ground zero from the 1980 Mack Lake Fire. And for those who don't know about this fire, the 1980 Mack Lake Fire was started as a prescribed fire by the Huron-Manistee National Forest. It was supposed to be a 28-acre prescribed fire and flash fuels. There had been a jack pine clear cut, and the district was trying to burn the slash off for reforestation efforts preceding planting. That didn't work so well. They lit the fire in the morning, trying to beat winds and weather coming that would have brought higher fire danger. The fire escaped about noon, and one of our dozer operators was killed trying to stop that wildfire. We also lost 44 structures in the Mack Lake subdivision, and approximately 24,000 acres was consumed by the end of that day. And along with fatalities and structures lost, it also completely destroyed the Huron-Manistee National Forest reputation, a reputation that we continue to try to build back today. So a lot of long-lasting impacts from that day. And the Maple Ridge burn, as I said, is located right adjacent to the subdivision you're looking at on the picture there. And the homes that you see there, the one on the right was lost in 1980. The one on the left survived both the 1980 fire and the 2012 fire, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. Next. Okay, if you want to know more about the Mack Lake Fire, I recommend going to this website or just Googling the Mack Lake staff ride. It is an internet program that will teach you about that fire, and you can also go through this on the ground in the field. And if you want to do that, you can contact my ranger district, and we'll actually try to schedule a time to host the staff ride. It takes 4 to 5 hours in the field to learn about what actually happened at the exact sites back in 1980, and it's an excellent training opportunity from a fire behavior, fire leadership, fire management perspective. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to advance you from 1980 to 2008. We started prescribed burning out in the Mack Lake Basin about this time. I don't believe any other prescribed burns were done right next to the subdivision for nearly 28 years because of the history of this area. But fuel breaks had been built shortly after 1980, and the district continued to maintain them, but we hadn't used fire to maintain those fuel breaks. But we chose to do that in 2008. We cut jack pine, piled it, and burnt it. And we got some very concerned residents. We expected that, had to work with them to explain why those piles wouldn't become a wildfire. And for those of burnt piles can be maybe more complex politically than broadcast burns because you have a lot of heat for a long time. Our broadcast burns, it takes a few hours and then the smoke mostly dissipates, but piles can burn for days. But we started getting people accustomed to the fact that we did need to use fire and we were going to use it. And so that was the current start to this journey. Next slide. Okay, in 2010, we got what is frequently called stimulus funds. That's American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds. When we had the economic collapse, there was significant funding for fuels management in the Forest Service. And you'll see on the right the air photo of the Mack Lake subdivision and the expanded fuel break complex. In areas, that complex is double wide and redundant. And we essentially doubled the size of the fuel breaks throughout the majority of the subdivision, with the exception of the very northwest part of the subdivision. You can see a smaller set of fuel breaks up there in the northwest portion of the lake. Those fuel breaks were not expanded, and they remained at approximately 200 feet. And I want y'all to remember that 200-foot number because we're going to come back to it a number of times here in this presentation. And I just want to tell folks a little bit of fuel breaks aren't designed to stop a fire by themselves. Imagine a fuel break being a baseball bat, and imagine a crown fire, a wildfire, as an 800-pound gorilla. That fuel break is designed to hit that 800-pound gorilla, but someone's got to swing it. and that's firefighters. And the way you swing a fuel break is you usually ignite it. So part of the story of this prescribed burn is not only fuels management and creating habitat for an endangered species, it's also training our firefighters and our publics how we're actually going to use these fuel breaks. Because a fuel break just standing in the way of an approaching crown fire, it will help you, but you won't get the full effectiveness out of it. Next slide. Okay, this is a map of the 2012 Little Mack Lake wildfire. It was an 800-acre crown fire, started about 7 o'clock at night, April 25th, 2012. Forest Service, Michigan DNR, and the local volunteer fire departments all worked together to suppress this fire. The fuel breaks in the very northwest corner of the subdivision were used. We did burn one of those 2 fuel breaks out as the fire approached the subdivision, and there was no structure loss in this fire. It was a grass fuel break with oak overstory in it. We lit that about 1 o'clock at night, and overall it made the fire suppression effort very easy. The crown fire did a glancing blow to the subdivision. It wasn't a head-on hit with the crown fire. But the big story is, after 32 years of many people viewing, certainly locally, the Forest Service was incompetent at fighting fire or using prescribed fire, you now had a much different political dynamic. You had people that saw all the efforts of all the firefighting agencies. Of course, they were very pleased and happy with the professionalism of the folks who fought that fire. No structures were lost, and it was a successful day. So really, for the first time in 32 years, the tide had changed quite a bit, and the politics were more in the agency's favor. Next slide, please. Okay, after that wildfire, we looked at the fuel break complex, and other than that very northwest corner where the Little Mack Lake Fire had bumped into the subdivision, there wasn't any more work for the Forest Service to do on the Forest Service side of the fence other than maintain our fuel breaks. But we did have significant fuel loading still in the subdivision on private land, and of course what we were worried about is a high-intensity crown fire. They can spot easily a quarter mile, sometimes more than a mile, and so it was capable for firebrands to jump our fuel breaks. So we wanted to deal with the fuels on those private lands. So we did something we've never done before, and we asked the Homeowners Association if anyone would be interested in allowing us to treat their land, and federal funds would pay for it. We got 6 takers on that. We picked homeowners that were adjacent to our fuel break, and in the picture on the left, the grass in the foreground, that is the Forest Service fuel break. Then across the road is the private property. We wanted properties that, if we treated them, would further expand the effectiveness of our own fuel break. So, the picture on the left is before, and this resident wanted all jack pine removed. So when we finished hand cutting, piling, and burning the jack pine, you can see the fellow's house in the background there. And pretty good spot for firefighters to auger into, even if the fire bumped their fuel break, protect that house, and then suppress any firebrands that may have landed in adjacent lots. So I guess the take-home of the last few slides is, from 2008 to 2013, we really worked hard in a variety of different ways to change the dynamic of public perception of the Forest Service not being a competent organization to use prescribed fire or conduct fire suppression, to the exact opposite. And I think overall we did a pretty good job at that. We had most residents who were willing to support us. Next slide, please. Okay. So So there's a lot of human factors involved in this project due to the location of the prescribed burn that we were proposing. The picture on the right, that's James Swiderski. He was a dozer operator we lost in 1980. I still work directly with his family. I laid a wreath at the Michigan Firemen's Memorial along with two other Forest Service employees, Chris Peterson and Jay Noggle, last month. And so 34 years later, the journey continues and the healing continues. And I don't care to repeat it. So we're going to talk about risk and how we can try to protect our firefighters and our publics. And we'll go into that in a little more detail. But in recent history, the Forest Service had a very tarnished reputation, but very recent major successes. Some of the residents still live in the subdivision from the 1980 fire, and they remember that day very well, of course. And another issue is, from a management perspective, Crown Fire had never been used as a management tool on the Huron-Manistee. I believe mostly because what happened in the Mack Lake Fire shied people away from it. Probably a great understatement. You know, and there was a lot of fear internally and externally with the proposal to use Crown Fire. It had never been done before. Politically, it was in exactly the area where we had a tragedy. But the 2012 fire gave us a perfect control feature so that whatever fire we lit in the burn block we're going to show you had an enormous fire control feature around it. So next. Okay, so now we're going to get into the Maple Ridge prescribed burn itself. I'll orientate you all on the map here real quick. You can see the perimeter of the 2012 Mack Lake Fire, and then you see a small, pretty much square pocket of jack pine in between the perimeter of the Little Mack Lake Fire and the subdivision. That area of jack pine is Maple Ridge burn, and you also see a smaller sliver on the map, which is the Fuelbreak that we wanted to expand from 200 feet to 300 feet. Again, that 200 and 300 foot numbers are numbers to remember as we go through this presentation. The project decision was to burn 50 acres with high intensity Crown Fire, construct a 3-acre Fuelbreak, bringing the Fuelbreak from 200 feet out to 300 feet. And our hope was to regenerate as much as 43 acres to jack pine, which would become Kirtland's warbler habitat. Kirtland's warbler likes to live in young jack pine, about 5 and 15 years of age. And also there was a 996 acre MMA. And for those who don't know what that is, that means maximum manageable area. And although this was a 50-acre fire, the decision approved the fire burning as much as 996 acres. So an example of that would be if the fire moved out of the burn block and moved to the north into the old 2012 fire scar, that was acceptable to the agency, and the burn boss really could use just about any tactics he or she wanted to either monitor that fire or suppress it, as long as it didn't go outside of the MMA boundary, which is the blue line. So overall, the two objectives for this, number one, reduce fuels. We wanted to get rid of the 50 acres of jack pine right next to that subdivision. And we also wanted to create endangered species habitat. Next slide. Okay. Whenever I get into a fight, I always want it to be an unfair fight with everything to my advantage. And so we looked at the risk of, what is the risk of leaving that jack pine there, having it catch on fire, and having all the different fire suppression agencies try to deal with an out-of-control wildfire? Or are we going to go in and do a prescribed fire and try to control all the variables as much as humanly possible and get rid of that fuel in a controlled way? So I'm going to talk a little bit about risk here. I'm not going to go through every one of these bullets. I think you all can read them. But there's two different risk considerations here. We do the management ignited fire. We can pretty much control all our variables. We can do this burn with all the variables in our control. But if there's a problem, it's the agency's fault. The political risk is accepted by the agency if we do a prescribed burn. It was my choice to accept that political risk. And the reason why is if I didn't accept that political risk, what I did was transfer all the risk to a safety risk to our citizens and our firefighters, meaning we're just going to wait for worst case scenario of a wildfire to hit this subdivision, and then we're going to try to put it out. And that's really maximum risk to our firefighters and the public. And as we saw that picture of Jim Swiderski earlier, I don't want to have to go talk to a family later for losing a firefighter. That's the worst case scenario I could possibly manage. So this is all about risk and how we take it. And I viewed that doing a prescribed burn with the type of control features we had was a much better thing than doing nothing and allowing a wildfire at some point in the future. Next slide. Okay, once I made the decision, we had public meetings with the residents of the Mack Lake subdivision, and about half of them were very supportive and half of them were very concerned, which is common, actually. A lot of projects are like that, so I was surprised, but we had done a lot of good work, and with us protecting the subdivision just a year earlier, people had a very positive viewpoint of what we were capable of doing. The resident appealed. They were worried about impacts to a bald eagle nest along the lake to the east. They were worried about the visual aesthetics of burning right next to their house. It would look ugly. They didn't think there was a need for Kirtland's warbler habitat. And they also, here's that 200-foot number again, they also felt that the 200-foot fuel breaks were adequate and there was no need to increase the size. And also they most certainly were worried that there would be a repeat of the 1980 escape, and especially with the type of fire behavior we were talking about. You know, we weren't hiding anything from them. We made sure they understand this would be a full-on crown fire. Next slide. Okay, the decision to go forward with the project was upheld. We tried to work with the appellants to see if we could informally resolve it, and we just couldn't. You know, they did not want us to burn, and we felt we did need to burn and that it would be safe to do so. The review of the appeal, they found no breach of law, policy, or regulation, so that's why the decision was upheld. The burn plan and the decision document did have a prohibition on a west wind, so we weren't going to blow smoke and firebrands into the subdivision or towards the eagle's nest. So that was covered in a mitigation measure. There is a need for Kirtland's warbler habitat. It is an endangered species, and we struggle to meet the acreage that we've said we need to try to manage. And we did recognize there was an impact to scenery. I explained to residents and the appellant, we knew the area wasn't going to look as good as it did before, but public safety and firefighter safety took precedence. I couldn't put scenery in front of safety concerns, and I was very open and straightforward about that. Next slide. Okay, one of the biggest questions both internally and externally is how are we going to control this high intensity fire? And I'm not going to go through all these bullet points word for word, but bottom line, what we did was take away fuel, weather, time, and space for the fire to escape. We just weren't going to give it the opportunity to do that. Had extremely strong fuel control features such as fuel breaks, crown fire scar up to a mile deep, and wetlands surrounding the project. We intended to do the burn in the evening, not during the morning or afternoon, near when the burn window would start to collapse. So even if the fire did cause problems, Mother Nature would shut it down quickly. Also, the evening conditions there would be light winds, and the maximum manageable area, which was almost 1,000 acres, gave the burn boss a lot of flexibility. If we knew the fire would jump out of the 50-acre burn unit, at least with spot fires, because of the high intensity of it. And they had a lot of room to operate and in very low fuel loading because of the Crown Fire 2 years prior. Next slide. Okay, both internally and externally, got a number of questions of, well, how can you be so confident of this? You've never done this before. And to a certain extent, that was true. We've never done a prescribed fire on this district, or I think even on this forest, that is true high-intensity Crown Fire. However, we had burned pole-sized jack pine during the summer. The goal was to thermally thin it, and we did intend, and we did get single and group tree torching on that prescribed burn, and you see that here in the picture. You're looking across a 300-foot fuel break. You can see the dead trees. Most of the jack pine was killed, and the green canopy you see there, those are red pine trees that survived. Much higher fire resistance for the red pine. And we got about 30% stand mortality. The fuel break was on the pressure side of this burn, meaning the wind was pushing against the fuel break. And so all your spot fires would occur in the fuel break. And we did get one spot fire at about 200 feet out. So there's that 200-foot number again. So we had done this before, but to a lesser intensity of fire, not quite as high intensity as what you're going to see in a little bit. Next slide. Okay, why didn't we just do what we've always done for the past 34 years and cut the timber, mechanical harvest, and then come in and trench and plant jack pine if we wanted to remove the fuels and get Kirtland's warbler habitat? A couple reasons: cost, ecological concerns, and timing issues. This is going to take us a fair amount of time, both to do the environmental assessment and to issue a timber sale contract and get the timber harvested if we went that way. But this timber is so small in diameter, the last time we did any work in this area, we had to pay $710 an acre to remove the jack pine. So major cost and timing issues with trying to mechanically remove the timber, and then you also have a major cost for reforestation compared to a prescribed burn cost where you're only dealing with not 100 ACE, but $100 an acre. So major cost considerations that benefited using prescribed fire. When we burn this timber, it should naturally regenerate with no reforestation. And ecologically, that's the ecology of jack pine. There's no soil disturbance. We don't have to plant. You get all the snags, down wood, all the ecological benefits of a fire versus coming in with a mechanical harvest. So we felt with the fire control features we had, going with the prescribed burn was both the most ecologically sound and financially sound way to do this. So next slide. Okay, another question, again, back to how can you control this fire? And everything I'm saying is all fine and dandy, but if you can't control the fire, this project is a loser. And so, you know, we had to do the homework both internally and externally to show people how a fire like this is managed. And I'll go back to the Mack Lake Fire. That fire was started at 10:30 in the morning. By noon, it had escaped, and then it had all day to run wild, and that's exactly what it did and went 24,000 acres. So we wanted to flip that on its head. We wanted to burn in the evening or at night, not morning or afternoon. And we wanted to burn on evenings where we had predicted, high humidity recovery, where even if we had a problem on the burn, it was only a matter of an hour or two before Mother Nature would shut the burn down. And so you can see here, you've got a 14-degree temperature drop between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night, and a 22% increase in humidity, and winds going from 5 miles an hour to 0. So you see how just over 2 hours your burn window collapsing. And when humidities get into the 60s and 70s, your fire behavior's over around here. And you see that by 2300. and then you see the high humidity recovery throughout the night. Next slide. Okay, this is one of the things we had to make sure we informed the public about so they understood. You know, some people thought as long as they can keep the Forest Service from lighting another prescribed burn, they'll never have another big fire that will impact the subdivision. Well, unfortunately, that's not the truth. This whole area is filled with jack pine that you see on this map, and you can see 3 major wildfires. I'll start with the most recent on the left. That's the 2012 Little Mack Lake Fire, 800 acres. Just to the north, the 1999 ATV fire, again about 800 acres. And then on the right, the No Pablo fire, which was in 2000, and that was 5,200 acres. So you can see this area likes to burn. It always has. Almost the whole area on this map burnt in 1980, and almost the whole area burnt in 1946. So you're not getting away from a fire hitting this subdivision. It's not if, but when. And so, you know, you really do have the choice. Do you want to fight an 800-pound gorilla on its terms on the worst day when it comes marching into your subdivision? Or do you want to pull the trigger yourself and put the handcuffs on that 800-pound gorilla and thump him on the head with a baseball bat called a fuel break? So that was a decision we had, and we did decide to go forward with the prescribed burn. Next slide. Okay, here's your fire control features. I'll just go to the top left. You can see that's the fire scar from the 2012 Little Mack Lake Fire. And there's no, in most of the burn, there's no crown fuel anymore. The trees were killed by the crown fire. And the ground fuels are very sparse. Then moving over to the top right, you can see the 300-foot fuel break. And when we implemented the Maple Ridge burn, that fuel break was black. We had burned off the short grass in it. So you had no available fuel, no potential for surface fire spread. Then down to the bottom left, you had the swamp and grassland on the south side of the burn area. And that it was wet. There was water in it when we did the main burn. And then on the bottom right, it's a close-up picture to the one in the top left, and it just shows the sparse grass fuels. This picture was taken in 2013. We implemented Maple Ridge in 2014, and the grass coverage was probably double that by the time 2014 came around with another year of growth, but it was still discontinuous and a short grass fuel Model 1 for folks who are familiar with those fuel models. Next slide. Okay, here's a aerial picture of the burn unit. You can see the crown fire scar from the Little Mack Lake Fire on both the west and the north sides of the rectangular burn block. You can see the fuel break by the subdivision, which is the east boundary of the burn block. And then you can see the swamp on the south side, which is wet and or grass fuels, and you can also see some aspen stands right there. So you had some pretty easy fuel types on the east and the south sides, and almost impossible fuel types for a fire to move through on the north and west. Next slide. Okay, I'm taking a break here because I've been talking a bunch, and I want to look at some of the questions here real quick.
And I think we had two, Steve. One is the fire breaks and how whether that results in any fragmentation of the habitat.
Yeah, it doesn't result in fragmentation in general, but we do lose a little bit of habitat. You know, we're not going to replant to jack pine in those fuel breaks, so if you decide you're going to build a 50-acre fuel break in Kirtland Warbler habitat, you're losing 50 acres that could be planted for nesting. So not really fragmentation, but you do get loss of habitat, and we do have to consult with Fish and Wildlife Service on that. But we haven't had a problem. We have enough acreage that if we take a little bit out for a fuel break, it does not affect our ability to produce the acreage. So good question. Okay, and then I got another one here. It says, was any jack pine harvested prior to the prescribed burn? We have, historically, all of our Kirtland warbler habitat creation has been through clear cutting and planting. However, on this project, there was no commercial harvest of jack pine. The only mechanical work done was by Forest Service employees. They were the ones who expanded the Fuelbreak from 200 feet to 300 feet, and that meant cutting the 33-year-old trees, piling them, and burning them. So, and that was done in 2013. So it wasn't really a harvest, but we did mechanically treat about 3 acres. Okay, want to talk a little bit about weather before we talk about fire behavior. What you're seeing here is a very rudimentary screenshot of the Mayo Raws Station, which is the Forest Service weather station about 6 air miles to the north of the project area. Those line spikes are rainfall events, and so we had a rainfall-free period of about 48 hours before we implemented the burn. The burn was implemented on Mother's Day, May 11th of this year. And you can see the week prior we had a fair amount of rain, and I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to bring you all the way up to May 11th, 2014. We began to ignite the perimeter of the Maple Ridge prescribed burn at 1900 hours. The picture you're seeing here is the backing fire we were lighting off the north control line, and talk a little bit about weather and resources. On scene, we had 3 dozers, tractor plows, 6 fire engines, 1 utility vehicle that had a water tank on it, had a fixed wing spotter plane over the area, so if we got any long range spotting, we could see that with the plane and direct people to it. And we also had a Type 3 helicopter on scene, also to assist with aerial reconnaissance. Weather at the time, 7 o'clock, temperature was 75 degrees, RH was 31%, which is very typical fire weather for us in the spring and certainly capable of supporting crown fire. Winds were 1 to 3 miles per hour, and the probability of ignition was 40% at the time. And we'll talk about rainfall again. This is important for folks to realize in the lake states, and many do and many don't realize this, so I'll reiterate it. It had been 2 days since our last rain. It had rained 0.07 of an inch, so a wetting rain, but not a lot of rain. And that was on the 9th of May. And during the week prior to this burn, we had 1 inch of rain and multiple rainfall events throughout that week. It had been a wet week, and this has been a wet and cool year in general. So the only drying we had to conduct this burn was Saturday, the 10th, and then Sunday, the 11th. And it only took 2 days for this thing to dry out for us to do what we wanted to do. And you'll see the fire behavior from that here in just a little bit. But what you're looking at here is the very initial stages of the prescribed burn, where we were lighting the north perimeter of the burn and allowing the fire to work against the wind and back into the unit. The reason we were doing that and allowing the fire to back was not because we didn't want it to spot over our fire line to the north. We knew it would. The wind was coming from the south. It was going to blow firebrands to the north. But that north line had the main power line coming into the subdivision, and we did not want to burn up the power poles or arc the power lines, and I certainly didn't want to be answering to the residents why their power went out for 2 or 3 hours. Politically, I'm sure we could have survived that if the burn was successful, but I certainly didn't want to deal with that. So we wanted to get the fire backed away from those power lines before we let any crown fire occur. Next slide, please. Okay, here's an aerial shot of us backing the fire off of the north line, and this was taken from the spotter plane, and you can see a fairly consistent low intensity backing fire through most of that, but also on the right hand side, you can see some torching and some group torching. Anywhere that backing fire hit any jackpots of fuel, it would jump up and get to the crowns of the trees. So we were comfortable at that point. We had the conditions to get the crown fire that we wanted in the main body of the unit. And that was lit by strip head. We were lighting very small strips, run, and then it would back the rest of the way. And we did that till we got a good 100 feet of depth off of that north line. Next slide. Okay, so we continued with ignition on the northeast and west flanks from 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night. That picture on the right is real representative of the type of fire behavior we were getting with the backing fire. On-site weather at about 8:20 at night was temperature 71 degrees, RH 38%, and still light winds out of the south and southeast. And again, we had flame lengths of about 2 feet with occasional flare-ups and torching. Next slide.
Yeah, Steve, any idea on what the jack pine needle moisture levels were at?
Yeah, just got that information this morning, and it was 104%. So very low, and certainly capable of supporting crown fire if you put enough heat into it. Good question. Okay, so this picture was taken from the residents on the other side of the fuel break. We were standing in their front yard talking to them. Obviously, they were concerned, but they were also very interested too, because they were about to get quite a show. They got to see in real time what you're going to see on video. And we weren't having any control problems immediately across the north line. We were having some short-range spotting, which the crews did knock down. We used a combination, the firing boss used combination strip head firing, interior spot ignition, using very pistol hand-fired munitions, and also some center firing. So again, this picture was taken sitting with the residents, trying to keep them calm as we implemented this. And strip head fire, we started lighting the main crown fire at 8:30, and again, we started ignitions at 7 o'clock. So it took us about an hour and a half doing some of the perimeter ignition. Next slide. Okay, here's an aerial picture of both the perimeter ignition. You see what you're looking at is the northeast corner of the burn unit, and you can see the power line road there. You can see the fuel break. You can see the perimeter ignition along the fuel break on the east line. You can also see some of the very pistol rounds that are starting some fires more interior to the unit. And the goal was to get this fire to really mass ignite the unit, get it to pull together and be done with and over fairly quickly. Next slide. Okay. So here we go. The southern portion of the unit was ignited with strip head fire. Flanking fire and center fire combined with the north running strip head fire, pushed by a south wind to consume the majority of the unit within approximately 5 minutes. Weather at 9 o'clock at night had temperature dropped to 68 degrees. Humidity had risen from 31% up to 47%. Winds remained light out of the south-southwest. We don't know for sure, but we certainly feel flame lengths were over 100 feet and below 200 feet at the peak of the crown fire run. The height of the timber in this is about 35 feet. You'll see in the video you can make your own judgments on how high you think those flames got. It's a little hard to tell in the smoke. Next slide, please. Okay, crown fire traveled an estimated 1,041 feet in just 3 to 5 minutes. That's an estimated rate of spread anywhere from 189 to 315 chains per hour, or 2.3 to 3.9 miles an hour. And to give some context to that, a very fast walking pace on smooth ground, which is what we do for firefighter pack test in the wildland community, is 4 miles an hour. So given the fact you're in rough terrain and vegetation, you would have had to run to escape this fire, and it's not wind driven. This is under light winds. We only detected one spot fire, other than spots immediately across the power line, and you can just barely see the power poles on the bottom right of this picture. But we just got one spot. It was measured at 298 feet away from the burn edge, and it was suppressed by hand tools. It was just in short grass, and the guys and gals got out there and beat up on it, and that was the end of it. We did have multiple small spot fires right along that power line corridor, and the crews did put those out just so they didn't become a headache. But again, we had black for nearly a mile to the north, so it was not a concern. But I want to go back to that 200-foot number. You know, the one resident who appealed said 200 foot's fine. Well, 200 foot wasn't even good enough for a little tiny crown fire under prescribed fire conditions. So it's certainly not going to be a big enough fuel break on its own under, you know, a wildfire if you're getting hit head on by a crown fire. So there definitely was, and we knew there was a need to have these fuel breaks larger than 200 feet. Next slide, please. Charles, you going to go for the video here?
Yep, let's hope this works.
All right.
I'm going to turn the volume up a little bit.
That's firm, John. It should pull right on through and look really good from there. Smoke's lifting good. I have no issues with spots on the north end at this time. All right, copy that.
This was taken from the resident's front yard. Okay, so that pretty much shows the main crown fire run. It didn't take more than another minute or two for that crown fire to run from south to north and consume the whole unit. You know, that looked like a little horizontal roll occurring on the edge of that smoke column, and the flame lengths were easily twice to 3 times the height of the trees. So pretty intense fire behavior, only 2 days after rain. But we only got one spot fire 300 feet out, and that's because of we were doing this at night. We didn't have the probability of ignition that would have supported that. So next slide, Charles. Okay, this is just a quick schematic of where that spot fire occurred. You can see the north edge of the burn unit and the subdivision there, and we got the one spot 300 feet out, and it was easily suppressed. Probability of ignition was estimated about 40%, mostly because we didn't have sun on these fuels. There was no fuel temperature to help with spotting. And we also had heat tiles out there that were placed anywhere from 3 feet to 16 feet heights throughout the burn unit. The lowest temperatures measured were 200 degrees, but most of the heat-sensitive paint tiles indicated 800 plus degrees throughout the burn unit. So, when we talk about fuel breaks and this fuel type, you really do need 300 foot plus to give your fire folks a chance to stay away from the heat. I could feel the radiant heat on my face from that fire, which was about 400 feet away from me because I was standing in the residence yard when that video was taken. So if we're going to protect people in subdivisions, we need some pretty good sized fuel breaks and type of fuel. Next slide. Okay, the southernmost strip of the burn unit at the south end near the swamp was lit about 9 o'clock at night. Temperature 68 degrees, RH 47%. The entire ignition portion of the burn was done by 9:10 in the evening. There were no spotting or holding concerns, essentially no suppression action other than hand tools for that one spot to the north. By 2200, the temperature had dropped to 61 degrees, humidity 50%, and we released most of our fire suppression resources. We were done. It was getting wet and cold, and it was nighttime. And the picture here is that last strip of crown fire moving through the jack pine during the nighttime hours after 9 o'clock. Next slide. Okay, want to show you some actual numbers from the weather station. I showed you that sample burn window that we showed the public of how we wanted to do this and how we could make sure this fire stayed where it belonged. And you can see between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, we went from 76 to 67 degrees, and humidity went from 28% to 48%, and wind went from 8 miles an hour to 3 miles an hour. So you can see the temperature going down and the burn window collapsing. That's exactly what we wanted, so it was a good day to burn. Okay, next slide. Okay, fuel loading, we did some Brown's transects, and we went from 30 tons an acre to 7 tons an acre. And almost all of that decrease in fuel loading was out of the litter and duff component. So very successful at reducing fuels. And of course, everywhere we had crown fire, there was no crown continuity anymore. So you had eliminated the possibility of a crown fire. Next slide. Okay, here's what it looked like immediately afterwards. So clearly we had met the fuels reduction objective in the unit. Next slide. Okay, then another one of the concerns was, we've seen it over and over, jack pine regenerates with fire, but we've never done that with the crown fire ourselves. So we were wondering, what's going to be the results of this? And you see a quarter on the ground there to give you some size perspective, and you can see a whole bunch of jack pine seeds. For those who have never seen them before, they're like little helicopter wings. When you drop them, they just kind of auto-rotate to the ground. And so there's a lot of seed on the ground. This picture was taken just after within a few days of the prescribed fire, so you don't see any grass coming up yet, but you definitely see seed all over the place. We'll do first, third, and fifth year stocking surveys to generate some real statistics. But of course, the next question is, are they going to germinate? Next slide. Okay, this picture was taken on August 1 of 2014, and you can see little jack pine coming up all over the place. So we've had a cool and wet summer, no droughty periods. So we're assuming that will help us with the regeneration. We'll conduct stocking surveys next summer, but it's clear walking in this area, we've got jack pine everywhere. So from a jack pine regeneration standpoint, it appears to be successful, but we'll have to wait for our stocking surveys to get some better statistics on that. And hopefully, the 2012, not the fire scare, but the 2012 fire scar and the RX burn will start supporting Kirtland Warbler anywhere from 2017 to 2019 when the trees get tall enough for the birds to be willing to use it as habitat. Next slide. Okay, results and conclusions. Many people looked at me when I proposed this and felt I was crazy. Maybe they're right, but I felt this was the right place and the right time. And, but they wanted to know, could the fire be controlled? And fire control, in my opinion, was very easy on this. We had incredibly strong fire control features. Did we get the hazardous fuels reduction that we wanted? And the answer is yes. There's no possibility of crown fire in this area for the next 10 to possibly 20 years, and certainly reduce the surface fuel loading. Folks wondered, would we regenerate the jack pine to create KW habitat? And it's very clear we've got good regeneration within the burn area. We just have to wait to quantify exactly what we've got next summer. Many were concerned that these a fire like this could spot quarter mile or more. Certainly did not do that. We did not get any level of medium or long range spotting other than the one spot fire about 300 feet out. That's not to say it couldn't occur, but we certainly didn't experience any type of long range spotting that one might be concerned about in that we've seen in our wildfires. And you know, are we going to do this again? And the answer is yes, hopefully with increasing frequency in areas that we can assure ourselves that we're comfortable we can control the fire behavior. Next slide. Okay, and I've got a question here. Were there any adverse smoke impacts with the mixing height falling in the evening? And the answer to that was no. The main column went up in just a few minutes. It put a pretty big pulse of energy, and it lifted that smoke. It didn't settle into the subdivision at all. The wind and the convection lifted it on to the north, and no real reports of anywhere getting smoked out. It is a little hard to follow that smoke, though, because when we do these at night, you know, you really have a hard time even using any aircraft to follow where this is going to go. So that is something we will have to model and pay attention to in future burns, and good question. But no issues with that. What are we going to do next? We're working on a project right now. You can see the map you saw earlier in the presentation. You see the perimeter of the 2012 Little Mack Lake Fire, and you see the project area for Maple Ridge next to the subdivision. And then the area circled on the top right is a proposed 400-acre burn, which would be a high-intensity jack pine regeneration burn. We'd use the Wildfire for the west perimeter for it, and Mack Lake for the south perimeter for it. And then we've got a series of fuel breaks and clear cuts and prescribed burns on the north and the northeast quadrants of that. And that would include another 800 acres of underburning, possibly be implemented in 2016 or 2017. And we would be using a categorical exclusion to authorize that for those who know NEPA. The clear cuts are already underway through previous projects. So NEPA-wise, quite simple. And public relations-wise, it may be pretty simple too. We're across the lake. The public has now seen this before. I wouldn't say they're used to it, but they've certainly seen successful examples of us controlling fire. Next slide. Okay, go ahead and skip this one, Charles. That's overkill. Okay, this is the Blockhouse project. This is an approved project. I signed a decision on this this summer, and there's 2 crown fire areas for jack pine regeneration for Kirtland's Warbler. Vertical striping is the area that will see crown fire, and it's sandwiched in between fuel breaks and prescribed burns and other natural features such as swamps and hardwood forest that the map isn't showing, but there is a 600-acre block and a 400-acre block. But you won't see that probably till at the earliest 2018, but more likely 2020, because we've got a lot of timber harvest and other prescribed burns to do that need to precede those high-intensity burn blocks. So we have a number of projects coming in the future that, if we're successful, we'll continue. And next slide. Okay, this map shows that same project area. It shows the areas that can have high surface fire or crown fire intensities, and it also shows the areas where we have hardwoods and swamps. So it kind of depicts the natural fuel barriers that we're using to sandwich crown fire in between them. And if you look where it says hardy grade, right in the center of that map, you can see on the left some area that's swamp, and on the right area that is hardwood, and it's just a moderate intensity surface fire fuel type. So we've sandwiched our crown fire in between those two natural barriers, as well as using fuel breaks and other tactics. So next slide. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. If there's any questions or comments, I guess we're open for that at this point.
Well, thanks, Steve. That was really interesting.
Not a problem. It's kind of a mouthful, but,
So if you have any questions, go ahead and type those into the chat box there. So is there any reason you started on the small area there to the west of the subdivision rather than on the north side of Mack Lake?
We went small, and we wanted to get rid of that jack pine that was right next to those houses. Politically, we had to go to the regional forester to get this thing approved. So a much bigger burn block, even though I know we could have done it, politically, I don't think it would have flown. So yeah, that's why we went for the small one. We had the high value assets of the homes we wanted to protect, and we didn't want to put out a project that would really get folks even more concerned, given the history of this area.
Sure. And so how does burning here in, say, the middle of May work relative to emulating the natural disturbance regime? I mean, how likely would it be for wildfire to start at this time of the year in this part of the world?
Well, I'll just go through the three main fires that we've had in the 10 years I've been on the district. We had one fire start, I believe it was April 30th, and we had another fire start April 25th, and we had another fire start May 18th. And those three fires burned a total of about 14,000 acres. So, all of our big crown fires are most common in late April through very early June. So this is normal. Us burning in the middle of May is exactly in the middle of fire season. So ecologically, you would expect to get these type of conditions.
That makes sense. So see if anybody has any other questions coming in. So here's one from Marjorie. Are you no longer managing for both timber and Kirtland warbler?
Well, that's a really good question. Yes, we're definitely managing for timber, but we only have so much jack pine, and most of it is not in rotation age yet. It's too young. It's what I call brush stage jack pine, for lack of a better term. So you can get, and it's something I didn't go into, our rotation age for jack pine is 40 to 60 years. It really takes 60 to 80 years to get jack pine mature, but in order to continue creating enough habitat, that's how the math works. We harvest on a 40 to 60 year schedule. But we can burn jack pine and regenerate it as young as 20 years. So in areas where it's safe to burn, we can get twice as many acres of habitat off the same acre rotationally, and that allows other acres to mature, and we can harvest them when they're older. And so it's going to benefit our timber production as well, the areas that we can burn, because what it does is basically hold us off, and we don't have to get into stands of timber that really aren't ready to be harvested yet.
And so if the stocking levels by year 3 in this area that you've burned are not high enough for KW, will you be artificially planting jack pine in these areas then?
Only if we see the rest of the Little Mack Lake Fire, the larger burn, also not regenerating. We could do that in the wildfire scar. I can already tell walking through this prescribed burn area, we're good. I don't see really any realistic chance of that happening unless we get a really droughty summer or something that kills off our regeneration. But it is possible we do that. The 400 acre burn block I was talking about that's in the top right of the map still on the screen. If we didn't get adequate regeneration in there, you know, we just don't want the land laying fallow. Yes, we would probably go in and plant. You know? But the burn still would have helped us. You know, in one afternoon, we've essentially removed the timber but left it ecologically for habitat. And if there's large pockets that don't regenerate, we may fill in plant.
Sure. Well, we've been studying the series of wildfires going back about 30 years or so in this area with the support of Joint Fire Science JFSP, and you know, that spatial heterogeneity looks to be pretty important from a habitat perspective, as well as trying to emulate those outcomes. So it'd be pretty interesting to see how one of these prescribed crown fires would match up with a wildfire in terms of that structural heterogeneity and complexity that we see in these areas.
Right, and you know, just from doing this, you know, we want to stay away from droughty periods, both from fire control and getting the seeds to germinate. And you know, the Maple Ridge fire is really kind of a test burn. It's a little guy. It's not big enough on its own to do anything for Kirtland's Warbler. That's why we had to match it up with the wildfire, and also the wildfire helped control it to a major degree. So, you know, in the future with some of these larger burns, you know, we'll really have to pay attention to the regeneration. We know how to plant, no problem. But it costs a lot of money, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of soil disturbance. You know, when you lose all your snags and a lot of your other ecological components.
So do you think red pine would survive this kind of fire?
This fire, no. There's nothing in that crown fire area that survived. I mean, the grasses and shrubs and forbs come back quickly, and the jack pine does, and so does the oak. It sprouts, but no. You know, even mature red pine couldn't have survived what we ran through there. No way. Nor aspen. There wasn't any aspen in this unit, but we would have regenerated the aspen too.
Great. Well, one last chance for any questions for anybody on board here today. Another minute. Yes. Don't see anybody typing. So just like to wrap things up here then. I'd like to thank Steve and everybody online for joining us this afternoon. Very interesting webinar and discussion. If you'd like to review the webinar or share with somebody that might be interested but missed it, we'll try to get a recording of the webinar up on the Lake States Fire Science Consortium website later today or tomorrow. And then I'd like to just remind everybody that our next webinar will be on November 20th and led by Tony D'Amato, formerly of the University of Minnesota, now up at the University of Vermont. He'll be sharing some of his research focused on the development of fire origin red pine forest of north central Minnesota. And if you'd like to access or see our complete list of upcoming webinars for 2014 and 2015, you can find that list up on our website. So thanks again, Steve, for presenting a very interesting webinar today. A great topic. And thanks everybody for participating today. Hope everybody has a nice day.
Yep. Thanks, Charles.